I would like to begin this conversation with an introduction. So please tell us a little bit about yourself, and please tell us what it's like to be an investigative journalist. Do you get jobs assigned? Can you pick your own jobs? So please, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Hi, thank you very much. It's very good fun is the short answer to what is it like being an investigative journalist, although not as glamorous as it might sound. It's much more likely to involve going through large numbers of documents or waiting on doorsteps to speak to people than it is anything more swish. So I'm an investigative journalist at the Times in London. I've worked here for 13 years and I've been an investigative journalist for just over a decade now. I write stories on a wide variety of topics, really, and usually those are things that I've become interested in. I've had contact or a source get in touch about, and they suggested that this is a worthwhile area to look into, and sometimes those are things that are commissioned by editors. And about 8 or 9 years ago now, I started looking into the pharmaceutical industry, and it was a suggestion of a colleague's actually that he'd read about the phenomenon of pay-for-delay deals, where companies were paying rival manufacturers to not bring a drug onto the market for a certain number of years in order to preserve their monopoly, and giving them usually giving them a cut of the profits on the side. So I went looking for evidence of that, whether that was happening in the UK and whether there were recent examples of that. And where I ended up was exposing a whole sort of cottage industry of companies in Britain who weren't quite doing pay-for-delay deals, but had discovered a way of taking old medicines and getting around the rules that the NHS puts on how they price medicines and dramatically increasing their price. We're talking thousands of percent, from a few pennies often to tens of pounds a packet, and making hundreds of millions of pounds in the process.
Thank you. I know that we have a few people on the line who have read your book, but I assume most people became very intrigued by the title. Your book came out a few years ago, and they have not had a pleasure of reading the book. And I was wondering if you can give us a spoiler, a teaser, couple lines, an anecdote, a story from your book, why they should give it a go after this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a copy of it with me here. This is the, it's not going to be very helpful with the blurring, but this is the paperback version. And it's in part a narrative, a story of how this sort of price hiking model was able to take hold both in the UK and in the US, of which one of the most prominent exponents was Martin Shkreli, who I think many people will be familiar with as a sort of notorious figure in this context, the man who increased the price of an AIDS medication from, I think it was $17 to $750 overnight. But at its heart, what it really is an exploration of why drug prices are so high, and how the industry has changed really since the Second World War, when it had emerged as a sort of force for with a real moral purpose and a sort of force for public good. And we developed a sort of social contract governing how medicines were funded and the rewards available for that private funding, and the application of a patent and a sort of state-granted monopoly for a certain period, and then evolving through the 1980s as it became more and more financially focused, and as various influential figures pushed it more and more towards driving up prices, and to the situation we have today, where even in very wealthy countries, medicines are often unobtainably expensive. So it's a sort of history / expose of the industry over the last 60 or so years.
Thank you, Billy. I found your book very emotional, and when reading it, I realized that I have the same feeling that I had as a teenager reading detective stories. I haven't read one since those years. So, and even though your book is not a literary work, it's an extremely well-documented piece of research. At one point, reading your book, I caught myself thinking it's tragic that your book is not fiction. Your book is a reality, and your book has incredible number of stories, characters, lifelines, and there are a lot of names in your book, and I'm sure you've done a lot of research, you had a lot of conversations, and I wonder if you actually spoke to these CEOs, and maybe CEO title is not the right tag, because obviously the decisions, corporate decisions we'll be discussing here are not made by one person. Maybe, and almost always, CEO is just the person who signs the papers and gives a nod, and maybe decision is done actually not by that person at all. It's just a nominal face of the company. Maybe not. So, but my question to you is whether you've had conversations with these people who are not too far from Martin Shkreli. However, they're a lot smarter because they're out of prison. They are leading very, very comfortable lives, and they are probably feeling very well about themselves, thinking that ethically they're just fine. So I want to see what you have to say about this.
Yeah, so one of the great things about journalism is getting to speak to people from all different walks of life and all different places in the hierarchy in the corporate world. And so, as part of the research for this book, I spoke to CEOs of some of the largest pharmaceutical companies, both current and former, but also all the way down to more junior staff members, and similarly with these smaller companies that were performing this particular trick or abuse with older drugs. Again, a kind of there across them. But I think actually some of the most revealing people in the book are not necessarily the most senior. There's a pricing consultant who I interviewed, who was for many years in the US this sort of go-to person if you wanted advice on how to price a medicine. And I found my conversation with him, as I relay in the book, really interesting and really eye-opening, talking about how when he first came on the scene in the 1980s, and through into the 1990s, the biggest barrier to higher prices in the pharmaceutical industry was the reticence of pharmaceutical companies themselves, and particularly at the sort of board level, and just an abundance of caution. They didn't want to be criticized, they didn't want to push things too far. And as he traces it, things started to change with the first biotechs, who were often companies that are much smaller, often based on the West Coast rather than the East Coast, had a more relaxed attitude to this, and also were producing medicines that, at least in the early days, were much more expensive to manufacture, and so necessitated higher prices. And as those started to come through, and they started to see far less pushback from health systems, particularly the US health system, than they expected, then other companies looked around and began to realize, oh, we can actually price these things a lot higher than we realized. And from there, in the 2000s, things really took off, and we saw medicines with higher and higher prices, medicines where the prices were being increased every year. You have this phenomenon of annual price hikes for drugs that are already on the market, and all sorts of abuses alongside that.
Your book starts almost romantically, basically talking us through how in the end of the 19th century, first pharmaceutical giants, which to become giants later on, were established, how they were established by quite daring people, many of them actually wanting to do good. So many of them had to move to the United States to get particular flexibilities to establish their businesses. Nothing in your book highlights this idea of profiteering, which at that moment, especially in the US, oil and steel industries were massively in business, making a lot of money. So, and then you take us through the World War II and the changes, and this idea of the social contract that you've just mentioned, and to then incentivizing private investment with public access to medicines, and the ways in which these have been distorted. And you introduce this distortion with a very heartbreaking example of AZT, the first AIDS drug that comes to the market in an extremely emotional time where young people are dying. Young people look at it as a hope, and they cannot afford it because welcome borrowers priced it the way they priced it, not inventing the drug itself. So would you call the AIDS crisis the pivotal point in the behavior of pharmaceutical industry, or do you think it happened before and it was just the illustration? And would you say that this crisis gave pharmaceutical industry massive confidence to move forward, realizing that now everything is possible if they pull through this?
So I think it's a pivotal point, but I don't think it's actually the point at which the sort of mindset and the approach that would then that sort of hold sway now and would go on certainly in the 90s and noughties to begin to hold sway broke through. I think that came particularly with the first biologics and a little bit later, because actually the lesson for the industry of that first AIDS drug, I should maybe perhaps briefly explain what happened for those that aren't familiar. But this was the first treatment available for AIDS that was launched in the 1980s, and the price tag was so high that it led to some very dramatic and very effective protest movements, including occupations of Wall Street. I think there was an occupation of the FDA's offices, all sorts of other pieces of direct action by very desperate people who needed this drug and couldn't get it. It's an illustration really of that essential tension at the heart of the industry, where you have the desire and need for private profit in order to facilitate the capital investment and the research that produces medicines, and the crucial public benefit that those medicines can bring. I think that the blowback that Burroughs Wellcome got contributed to that cautious approach that this pricing consultant spoke about as being the prevalent mood of pharmaceutical firms at that period. And similarly, 10 or 20 years earlier, there were a bunch of very public Senate hearings after a number of pharmaceutical companies were caught in a sort of cartel on antibiotic pricing, price fixing. So I think at that point, the industry's view as a whole was largely that we do have to be very cautious on pricing, that we don't want to risk this sort of reputational damage. The chairman of Burroughs Wellcome had to reinforce the windows at his country house because he was told that he was under threat. I think other executives looked at that and thought, well, that's what we want to avoid. But what they then saw was this kind of cultural change led by biotechs, contributed to by in the 90s and early noughties a slump in R&D productivity, and then pricing became a key lever to be pulled.
So in terms of the global market, even though your book in description focuses on the British pharmaceutical market, there's a plethora of examples from the United States, Canada, other countries. What is your view between US versus the rest of the world? Because it's quite clear it's very different systems. It's quite clear for the companies where they make the most money, and there's damage that currently is happening or has been happening, and it reflects not just in pricing as an opportunity cost, whether this money goes into marketing or R&D or share buybacks or salaries of CEOs. It's also about it's not just what we do with this money, it's what we could have done with this money if they were used in a better way. Mm-hmm. So what difference do you see between the United States and the rest of the world? And would you say that the US system is the cause of it all?
I basically would, yes. I mean, the book focuses a bit on Britain, but it has quite a lot on the United States and indeed other countries, because the United States is so pivotal. It's such a dominant force. It disproportionately to population size. The amount of revenue the industry generates from the US, the number of companies that are either based there or have large numbers of employees there, and the extent to which the US market skews the incentives for different types of drugs. So one of the issues that the book explores is the amount of clustering that we've seen in recent years around research and development in producing new cancer drugs and drugs for rare diseases. And those are both really products of skewed incentives in the US system, whereby those are the types of drugs that can command the highest prices in the US, and therefore those are the types of drugs that investors are most interested in backing. And I think that has a huge consequence for the rest of the world. The other thing, the other sort of key point about the US is the way in which those prices distort negotiations for other countries. Britain, on the whole, has quite an effective health technology assessment system through NICE for assessing the cost effectiveness of new medicines, but it's hampered by the extent to which sometimes companies can command exponentially higher prices in the US, and they don't want to bring them to the British market at the scale of discount that would be required to fit within that NICE test. And then drugs just don't get launched here. And one of the sort of human stories I tell in the book is of a teenager in Canada who needs a cystic fibrosis drug from Vertex, and that drug was not available in Canada. I think it may now be available in limited circumstances, but at the time wasn't available because they didn't want to have to sell it in Canada at a lower price and then have complaints from the American market. Well, if you can sell it to them for this much, why can't you do the same here? And so she ultimately died. She didn't get the drug. She didn't get the drug in time.
Yes, there's a lot of heartbreaking stories, and very few of them make it to books or to even the headlines. There are many stories that we don't hear. And the thing is that people who are listening to you now, who will be listening to this recording, people who will be reading your book, vast majority of them will be overwhelmed with feelings, shocked, completely not supporting the system. But do you think people who are very much against the current system actually realize that the system is built in such a way that we're all directly or indirectly caught up in that, and that with decades it has been built in such a way that the shareholder price is the only key objective? It's very nice when patient values align with that, but it's just nice. It makes everyone looks good. But the share price is what everyone who online right now and who's paying into the pension funds, these pension funds and their pensions depend on the share price of these pharmaceutical companies. And for example, to work at NICE, to work at MHRA, to work at the EMA, you cannot own shares of any pharmaceutical companies. However, we all pay pensions. Even if we pay government pension, they still go in the commercial market, they still invest. So have you, when writing a book, have you came across this dilemma? And what can people who are opposing the system even do to not support it? I mean, we can't be without pensions, right?
Yeah, so I think it's a very good point, and it's a tricky issue because companies have a legal duty to their shareholders. It's not as though the chief executive can just ignore that. I think part of what maybe is useful or needs to happen is a widening of the definition of stakeholders and what stakeholder benefits look like, and particularly a sort of more I think the key problem with it is how short-termist it is and how focused on growth in the next quarter it is, and the number always going up, and that actually sometimes that leads to decisions that aren't very helpful for a drug company in the long term, that they're much more interested in the short-term profits and a lower price with a bigger market. It might take longer because the manufacturing will be at a greater scale, and you need to put in place all the measures that need to be in place to sell a drug in different countries. But that may ultimately produce more revenue and certainly a more sustainable system. There was another part to your question, and I've just forgotten what it is, but it's something else.
That's all right. I'm sure it'll come up. So we have an interesting question in the chat. I assume this is from someone working in the pharmaceutical industry, and the question is, what can people working in principal and or commercial functions to encourage a culture away from the dirty tricks that you mentioned in your book?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've remembered actually what I was going to say the second half of the previous point, and it speaks to this as well. There are problems with the system as a whole, and with the incentives and duty to stakeholders and the rest of it that produces, forces people into decisions and approaches. But I think what's worth saying, and one of the things I hopefully lay out in the book, is the extent to which a lot of the problems that have arisen are abuses, even under the current system. A lot of the issues around pricing are that the old deal of a set period for a patent, and then the monopoly ends, and then the generics come in, and it's cheaply and widely available, doesn't work anymore, because companies have found ways to extend that monopoly, often artificially, sometimes illegally, and that can go on for many more years, and that's not money that was ever factored in when doing the equation of, is this worth investing in? But it's money that goes to the bottom line, and it's money that comes out of the health system and can't go to spend on other things. What can individuals do within a corporate culture? I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's a question that applies to lots of industries, not just the pharmaceutical industry. And I don't think there are easy answers. But I think it depends on the specific situation. So it's hard to kind of answer that, really. But I think it's other than to say, I think it's an interesting question.
It's actually interesting to hear from people working in the industry if they feel particular pressures, or if they feel any degrees of freedom to actually do anything, if they have particular ideas, or if they say something, they lose their jobs. So that's probably the inside information that you...
The pricing consultant I mentioned has quit the industry now, and is now a blues musician in the south of America. And he says the reason he quit is because companies were coming to him and saying, I can get whatever the price was, $5,000 for this drug. Can I get 15,000? Can I get 20,000? Can I get 25,000? And the answer was yes. The market will allow you to do that. It's not value. There's no clinical value there for patients, but that's the way the system, particularly in the US, works. And he just grew sick of it and left the industry. I mean, that's not a very helpful solution for most people. And if everyone just left, it wouldn't be very beneficial for anyone overall as a society. Because the other thing I want to make clear is this is not purely a criticism of it, and the pharmaceutical industry is very important. It's in everyone's interest to get this right, and to kind of recalibrate the incentives in such a way that we get the medicines that as a society we need, but also that we get them in a way that's accessible, because there's no point in having one without the other.
Yeah, so I will make a very quick comment to the point in the chat, and then ask you another question. So there is a comment in the chat that it should be stated that in the US, the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act will have an impact on drug pricing and downstream on R&D. And I find that particular statement very misleading, because it applies to medications which have been on the market for quite a few years, and this applies only to medications which patent is about to expire. So American lobbyists did a very good job ensuring that pharmaceutical industry maximizes its profits on these super impressively expensive drugs, and only at the very end they do some negotiation to bring prices down. Will it bring prices down? Of course, a little bit, but it does not resolve the question. And of course, it doesn't do what the HTA system does in Europe by cutting the price severely at the start before it enters the market. So the question from Andy, and I had very similar question for you. Being a journalist is a risky job. Being an investigative journalist is a very risky job. So the question from Andy is, when your book came out, did the industry react to your book? Did you get any pushback, response, threats?
Lots of the above, mostly before the book came out, I would say, and that tends to be true generally with investigative stories, is that people often make a lot of noise before publication. They're trying to stop something coming out, but once it's out, there's then a kind of higher bar. I mean, it's basically, do they want to sue or not, and do they think they have a case that they can win in court? So over my career, I've had a very long list of very long legal letters and making all sorts of threats, but I've so far not ever actually been sued. So yeah, I mean, with this book, there were certainly a lot of back and forth with lawyers, but not much since. I mean, I would like to think that's because there's can't remember how many words, it's 20,000 words of footnotes, and I've sourced and evidenced everything I write, and it's a very meticulous and hopefully forensic process, and I think it's, for those that haven't read it, it's alive as well to the challenges facing the industry. I mean, I think one of the big problems, and Jack Scannell, who I think is associated with this parish, who I quote at some length in the book, making this point that you have an industry in which health payers are up in arms about how high prices are, and investors in the industry aren't that happy either. That certainly for a long time, R&D, the return on capital was falling, and it appeared to be sort of irreversibly so. I think there's now a bit more hope that it may have turned a corner, and we're seeing different types of therapy and the advent of big data and AI and things that might change the equation a bit. But a lot of these changes were not just cultural changes, but in mindsets and also in personnel. The kinds of people that were running drug companies changed over the decades, from scientists often to lawyers, and then to salesmen, often salesmen with no background in the industry. But there were also scientific challenges that led this, and a slump in R&D productivity was a big driver. If you're not getting as many new drugs and as many big blockbusters through as you previously did, and you need to satisfy shareholders with growth every quarter, then pricing became the thing that you could turn to, along with all these other tricks of extending monopolies and buying off rivals and the rest of it.
Indeed. So how do you see, you've done a lot of investigative activities studying what has happened to date. What is your prediction for the next decade? It's a partially question from John Hickman, but all in terms of pressure to reduce prices. But there are many other forces right now, and I just mentioned there are new trends, new developments, huge hype around digital technologies. And the shift in the industry in many ways. So what is your prediction for the next 10 years? Will things get better, worse, much worse?
I think, well, I wouldn't want to necessarily predict, because there's so many variables, but I think we can certainly expect to see, as we've seen at the moment in the US and in the UK, a big effort by the industry to push back against pricing restrictions, and still a growing public clamour to do something on medicine pricing. I think that really had almost reached a tipping point, and then COVID came along, and obviously the industry played a major role with the vaccines, and that sort of put a pause on that sort of public feeling for a few years. And I think that's growing again, and particularly in the US, we've seen some of the Biden reforms that are along those lines. I mean, who knows if AI and other developments are going to dramatically change the cost of clinical trials or of research and development, and so I mean that would be the great hope, and that would then leave open the potential for massive reduction in pricing, potentially. I guess we have to wait and see. There's been plenty of false dawns before. The high throughput screening was supposed to be revolutionary, and I don't think ever quite lived up to the promise, and if anything was maybe damaging because of that. So yeah, I think probably otherwise we continue on the same lines, that the industry, there are some small concessions, the industry grumbles about it, things continue to remain very expensive in terms of accessibility, and everything kind of grinds on, and some patients get drugs and some don't. The other great challenge is gene therapies and these other cures, where a lot of health systems just don't really have the pricing model set up to cope with those one-time very large sums being demanded, and a lot of the early gene therapies had to come back off the market because they couldn't find any buyers. So that's something that needs to be solved, and whether that is going to be innovative pricing models or something different is going to be an interesting question.
It's once again completely theoretical, just your opinion, but who do you think should step in to try to change the situation? Or it's not even a relevant question just because the system is so complex, so locked into balancing many different interests, you can't even identify such a group, because we definitely cannot say that there is a lack of money. There's definitely lack of will. And if you, for example, see how philanthropy money is used in the US, the top recipient is God, absolutely top. So the money going to church dwarfs the money going to healthcare in terms of charitable giving. But not even that. Even if we just look at people who are concerned about healthcare, who do want to make a difference, a lot of times it's just personal feeling. It's easier to write a check to a top clinic rather than to save the girl in Canada who should have gotten the Vertex drug. And do you think philanthropy should play a role, or it might actually do worse because the pharma may say, hold on, we do have these angels who will fly in and fix these little things to make sure we save a face, and we'll just continue to do that? Because what seems like from your book is the government is tragically failing to do anything about the situation. In Europe, thanks to the HTA processes, they did not fix the system, but at least they put brakes on it for sure. So that is definitely a big difference, and at least that happened. It doesn't mean that resolves the global problem. Putting these brakes, we did have Vertex tragedy in the UK after the nice decision not being made on time, and children suffering, and many more to come. Some drugs don't come to Europe because of HTA. So do you see a particular player who can come to the scene, or it doesn't exist?
It's a very good question. I think for meaningful structural change, it's going to have to be in the US, and it might not necessarily have to be government-led. It could be insurer-led, or even these middlemen, PBMs, who get between the insurers and the manufacturers. I think if you can introduce some element of cost-effectiveness health technology assessment into that US process regularly, you can start tackling perhaps the biggest issue there, which is the very high prices that are commanded for drugs with very minimal benefit, certainly not cost-effective benefit. Often in cancer, particularly, you have drugs that have very small benefits and perhaps no impact on overall survival. But because of the insurance system and the way those drugs are administered and the types of situation patients will be in at the point they get there, they've already blown through any copay and the rest of it, that they're still revenue generators. I think that would be the most meaningful change. In the meantime, and perhaps more realistically, what can happen around the edges, and can philanthropy play a role? I'm sure it definitely can. I mean, I think one of the things I've traced in the book is what's happened with hepatitis C and with the drugs that Gilead brought to the market, although it itself bought them at quite a late stage from another company, and the impact around the world on the pricing that was set in the countries where that wasn't affordable. In the UK, it was rationed for a long time, and you saw third parties set up ways of accessing the drugs from India, for example, and helping people get them through the post or going on trips to India. I think in individual cases, those sorts of things can be life-changing or life-saving. I worry generally about, can philanthropy provide all the answers, because those Vertex drugs were themselves funded in their development in large part by the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the US. And what they didn't do was include any clauses on having control on pricing. And it's tricky, because for an individual interest group, it's in a rare disease, for example, it's not really in your interest to say we want lower prices for this drug, because you want lots of companies to develop to go, oh, that looks a lucrative area, we'll invest there and we'll try and develop new products. So I think it's very difficult for anyone outside the US to meaningfully change the structure. And then it's a question of, what do you want to do around the edges, and do you want to solve a short-term problem but contribute to the long-term issue? I think that's a kind of philosophical question, really, more than anything.
Yes, indeed. Since you've already touched upon it, private public money, hugely discussed topic, lots of books and papers written on it. who developed the drug, who commercialized it, how could they dare, who should develop drugs? Why did we give it to commercial sector to begin with? So what are your comments on that? Right now, it is quite clear that this is a huge machine operating based on its own laws and triggers and policies. Where is the public money coming in? Should there be more of that? Should it be going more into research? Should there be guards right there? Or should we even establish, I think there were attempts, and I think they have been very successful, of actually singling out particular diseases and just making sure it's a public good and these drugs will be public good, or it's not even possible in the current environment?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and the history of it's interesting. That the sort of medical profession was very skeptical of any involvement with commercial enterprises for many years, and in fact, one of the reasons the US got a jump on the fledgling companies in Europe was because of that reluctance, and then the reluctance around patenting didn't exist over there. I think public funding for science is really important, and is a really important tool as well in terms of shaping research priorities. I spoke to, for the book, a lot of scientists and people that have studied innovation and how drug development works in practice, and often it goes in clusters when there's been a breakthrough in the sort of base science in a particular area around a particular mechanism or a particular model. And so that early stage process is really important, where I think, and there has no doubt been lots of words devoted to this as well. It's a popular topic for activists. There is more that could be perhaps be done is around the clauses and conditions that are attached to public funding and to using to commercializing developments and innovations that have been publicly funded, and whether there can be restrictions on pricing or on access, because pricing really is a shorthand for access. Pricing doesn't, pricing only matters if it's affecting access. I think that's a kind of interesting area that there is room for, and there is room for movement on. Can a government commercialize a drug? Not at the moment. It's unrealistic. It doesn't fit with how public finances work, and you wouldn't be able to stand up in the House of Commons and say you'd lost $5 billion pursuing a promising candidate that turned out to fail at the last moment. But again, AI and data and the rest of it could lead to advances on that if we'd see a dramatic reduction in the price of clinical trials, which is often the big thing that the public sector can't afford. That could change things. That could change things there, but I think not for now. We've seen a little bit of. Antibiotics is the obvious one, and the problems that exist and the lack of market incentives for new antibiotics, where public funding is sort of involved even at a later stage. But I think, as you say, there is a vast industry and a vast mechanism that is built up, and you're certainly not going to replace that overnight with anything publicly funded. So it's much more, I think, about working with the current system than it is about starting again.
Through your book, and not just through your book, through a lot of news headlines, we see many types of Martin Shkreli's becoming coming to the scene, becoming even popular, or if not popular, they behave the way they think they should behave, and that became a normality. Do you think there is a chance of next Jonas Salk coming to the scene? And Jonas Salk, if somebody doesn't know, invented the polio vaccine and made it a public good. Or his time is gone because he could afford it, because it was back then, because it was possible. But if the next one, even if he wishes or she wishes to do so, patent law is such that by changing one little thing, somebody will patent this immediately and make it completely unaffordable. Or do you think we've had this interesting climate change movement, which New Generation has started some years ago? Any chance New Generation starting a movement in not necessarily drug development, but healthcare, to try to really draw attention, to try to bring people like John Salk to the scene, or do you think it, once again, it's not possible?
I don't think it's impossible, and certainly with vaccines, I'm not familiar with the intricacies. I think it's certainly largely publicly funded, if not entirely publicly funded. The malaria vaccine that the scientists in Oxford have been working on, and indeed the Oxford team that were involved with the coronavirus vaccine were publicly funded. So I don't think, but I think that if your question is specifically around would it have to be patented or not, I don't think that's necessarily the main barrier. I mean, you can patent it and then license it freely at a low rate around the world for manufacture. I think you would probably, it's unlikely to not do that because you want to retain at minimum some level of control on the process and ensure that it's being manufactured in places that are equipped to manufacture it and in places where they're equipped for delivery and the rest of it. But that sort of public spirited mindset still exists. I mean, there are lots of, there are plenty of people that fit that category. And I think generally, I mean, we've seen in kind of capitalism more broadly in the last 10 years or so, an emphasis on corporate responsibility and a sort of wider duty to the public at large, as well as specifically those who are shareholders, as part of a sort of wider effort to reframe capitalism. So I mean, that's sort of in keeping with the sort of thing you're talking about there.
We've discussed quite a bit about price setting, and obviously Europe has a different approach to the US. There's a comment and question from Paul Martin about finding out a real price, because it's actually very difficult because of discounting, because of a lack of transparency, because of bundling. And do you have any suggestions about this, and whether price transparency is needed? For example, personally, I am very much pro it. However, many of my colleagues whom I deeply respect have different views, saying that price transparency will make drugs unaffordable for patients in Brazil and India and many other countries which cannot afford European prices, and it does have the good side of it as well. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as I'm a journalist, so I'm in favor of transparency in general, in all sorts of realms, and light is the best disinfectant and all the rest of it. I do sort of agree with you there, really, that I sort of instinctively am in favor, but I've lots of people that I respect urge caution. I think for good reasons, as you say. There would need to be, and I don't really know how you sort of codify this, but there would need to be acceptance that you're going to have a tier of pricing, and not every country can afford the same price. And I think that's very difficult. I think you run the risk that you make pharmaceutical companies even more reluctant to give discounts in countries where they wouldn't otherwise be able to buy them, and they become even more focused on the wealthy markets, particularly the US market, and the others are sort of ignored even more than they are now. So I think in theory it sounds great, and why wouldn't you want it? And and as the whoever has written this question says it quite rightly, it is often very difficult to find out the true price of medicines, and the net price and the gross price and all the rest of it. But I don't think it's as simple a solution as it initially sounds. And as I say, lots of people I respect think it would make things worse, at least in the short term.
Yeah, and it's actually sad and tragic at the same time to realize just how smart the current system is and how well it has been engineered, that asking for something as obvious, as simple as transparency gets you to this catch-22 situation where even people who realize it's good cannot fully agree on that. So
I think if we can start by getting back to that original social contract of a set patent period that can't then be manipulated, and that you can then get lots of competition coming in, and that itself is a challenge for some of the biological medicines, but that's improving, then you strip away a lot of the issues that we currently have at that point, because you're then talking about price, but within a much more defined period. At the moment, the issue is you have high prices and they can continue almost indefinitely for some drugs. And it skews the whole equation. I think if you can get back to that as a starting point, things look much better, and then you can start to try and have an impact on incentivizing the right kind of drugs, reducing clustering and all the rest of it.
So what do you think about Mariana Mazzucato's call for nationalizing pharma?
Yeah, I think there's well, it sort of speaks the same as my answer a minute ago, really. I think there is a role potentially for a generic manufacturer, or a number of generics manufacturers that are state-owned and would help to reduce both the specific abuses in the generics market, but also often now there are just not enough manufacturers, not enough suppliers, and that's a sort of stability of the supply chain issue that would be solved by a national manufacturer. I just think it's unrealistic. I think it downplays the expertise and the complexity of taking the science that is often publicly funded in the early stages and putting it through clinical trials and producing a workable drug. And many times that doesn't work. To suggest we can do all of that with state funds, I just think it's unrealistic. I just think that it's risk that no responsible government could take on behalf of its citizens.
Mm-hmm. So you finished the book, it was been published, you've learned so much, you're really an expert on the subject. Are you still working in this field? Do you still write about pharmaceutical industry? What are your plans? Do you have any other books in mind?
Yes, I'd still write. So I don't write exclusively about the pharmaceutical industry by any means, but I'm still very interested in still writing about it. I'm working on a story at the moment that relates to this field. And if anyone watching has anything that they would like to draw to my attention, then please do. I'm on Twitter, and my email things are hopefully very easy to find. Yeah, and then alongside that, lots of other different subject areas that can vary quite a lot, from politics to business to social affairs.
Mm-hmm. And specifically for the Sick Money book, what was the most challenging part of actually producing this book? What was the most difficult for you?
The hardest thing was that most of it was mostly written and researched whilst having a full-time day job. So it was a lot of evenings and a lot of weekends, and it was a lot of research. I mean, it's a very complex area. A lot of it is very fraught. There's not, there's people with very strong views on both sides, and I wanted to try and do justice to that. So it was definitely a lot of work.
I can imagine, yes. So Mandy, I asked you what kind of pushback you got about your book, but my other question is, what was the best compliment you got from your book? Did you have any input from patients, maybe from some other groups, maybe some unexpected reactions after the book came out or before the reaction to your book?
Maybe the most unexpected actually was people who I dealt with in the past who work for pharmaceutical companies, often on the sort of legal or PR side. So not always the most friendly conversations. If I'm bringing them on, I'm about to write about their company in a negative light. And I've had a few people in that field who have read the book and sort of praised me on what a good book it is, basically, that they enjoyed it and that they thought it was well researched and that it really rang true. And so that was nice to hear from people that I quite often lock horns with.
Thank you. So any final words that you would like to share with your future readers? Anything else you'd like to say about your book, about your work?
No, I mean, if it sounds of interest, do give it a go. It's hopefully not as dry as this topic sometimes can be. There's lots of characters. I think there's a really interesting tale, and there's lots of unexpected. There were lots of things that were unexpected to me, the kind of unwitting consequences and kind of moments that became pivotal that didn't necessarily look like it at the time. do give it a go, and I'm always keen to hear feedback from readers. So if you do read it, or if you have read it, do get in touch.
Thank you so much, Billy. One thing I can say, it's a definite page turner. Incredible learning experience, just like you say, very well documented. Many cases you brought up I knew, but I did not know them in that eye-opening detail, and even rereading them was absolutely shocking. So massive amounts of work needs to be done, and thank you for taking up on the subject, being out of the field. I think the clarity with your talent of a writer that you brought to this is very, very important, because a lot of these issues often are being raised by researchers, these information being raised in academic papers, in policy documents. Some of this might be frankly unreadable or unreachable or not understandable. And the fact that you managed to put it in such a language that people not in the field would definitely enjoy reading. They might not enjoy how they're going to feel after that, but that's also your talent as a writer. So thank you so much for all the hard work. I can only imagine the number of sleepless nights, lost weekends, lost holidays that went into this book. Congratulations, and thank you for giving us these insights and for coming to Consilium. So
thank you very much.